Have you ever been in a really intense, stressful situation? So stressful that afterwards the details feel kind of blurry? We tend to think that these huge moments get burned into our brains forever. But when it comes to a court of law, that whole idea is put on trial. Today, we're jumping right into one of the biggest debates in psychology. How does anxiety really mess with an eyewitness testimony? Okay, picture this. You've just witnessed a crime. The police show up, the yellow tape goes up, and bam, all eyes are on you. You're the key. The entire justice system is counting on your memory to figure out what just happened. The little details you remember could put a guilty person behind bars, or, and this is the scary part, it could point the finger at someone totally innocent. And yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? When your heart is hammering against your ribs and adrenaline is just flooding your system, is your memory like a perfect high-def camera? Or does it start to get fuzzy, maybe even warp reality a little bit? Let's take a look at the evidence. All right, let's get into the first side of this whole debate, the idea that a big dose of anxiety is just terrible for your memory. And the main player here is something psychologists call the weapon focus effect. It kind of makes sense when you think about it, right? In a moment of serious danger, your brain's survival instincts totally take over, and your attention just narrows, and it zeroes in on the single biggest threat in the room, usually the weapon. And because of that, other really important details like the attacker's face or the clothes they were wearing might just vanish. Your brain is trying to keep you alive, not take perfect notes for a police report. So how in the world do you test something like this without, actually putting people in danger? Well, two psychologists, Johnson and Scott, came up with a really clever and now super famous experiment to try and recreate this weapon focus in a lab. So here's the setup. They had people sit in a waiting room, and they were exposed to one of two different situations. In what they called the low anxiety condition, the participants just overheard a pretty boring chat about equipment failing, and then a man walked out holding a pen. But in the high anxiety condition, they heard a full-on hostile argument, the sound of glass breaking, and then a man bursts out of the room holding a paper knife, covered in blood. And the results? Whoa, they were pretty dramatic. When they were later asked to pick the man out of a photo lineup, the group that saw the pen was accurate about 49% of the time. Not bad. But the group that saw the bloody knife, their accuracy dropped like a rock, all the way down to just 33%. That is a massive difference, and it all seemed to come down to their focus being glued to that weapon. So it seems pretty clear-cut, right? Case closed. The lab evidence points straight in one direction. The stress and fear from seeing the weapon just hijacked the participants' attention, and it totally tanked their ability to remember the guy's face. But psychology is almost never that simple. Yeah, because what happens when we step outside the neat, tidy world of the laboratory and into the pure chaos of a real-life crime? Well, the results might just blow your mind. So this brings us to this really cool study from 1986 by Ewell and Cutshall. They got this super rare chance to study the witnesses of an actual fatal shooting in Vancouver. Months after it all went down, they tracked down 13 of the real witnesses and did something brilliant. They interviewed them all over again, and they compared their new memories to the super detailed statements they gave the police right after the crime. They also asked them a really simple question. On a scale, how stressed were you? And this is where the story takes a massive twist. In a total contradiction to the lab findings, the real-world witnesses who said they had the highest levels of stress turned out to be the most accurate. Not the least. Their memories were amazingly solid, even 4 or 5 months down the line. So what is going on here? We've got one study in a controlled lab that says anxiety totally wrecks your memory, and then a real-life case study that says it actually makes it better. How can both of these things possibly be true? Well, this is where a really elegant theory in psychology swoops in to save the day. It helps us make sense of all this conflicting info. It's often called the Yerkes-Dodson law, but a more descriptive name is the inverted U hypothesis. Okay, just imagine a curve that's shaped like an upside-down letter U. Got it? So at really low levels of anxiety, your performance, your memory in this case, is pretty poor. You're just not that engaged or paying close attention. But as your anxiety starts to increase to a moderate kind of optimal level, your alertness sharpens up and your memory performance actually hits its absolute peak. This could totally explain those super accurate witnesses from the real-life shooting. But here's the catch. If that anxiety keeps climbing and goes into extreme fight-or-flight territory, your performance doesn't just level off, it crashes. The stress becomes overwhelming. And that could be exactly what happened to the poor participants who saw the bloody knife in the lab. So the big takeaway here is that anxiety isn't just good or bad for memory, It's all about the dose. The inverted U hypothesis gives us this great framework where both the Johnson and Scott lab study and the Yule and Cutshaw real-world study can actually make perfect sense together. But of course, as good critical thinkers, we can't just hear a neat theory and call it a day, right? We have to poke some holes in it. So let's dig into some of the problems and the messy details with all this research. Okay, first off, you've got the whole lab versus reality problem. Sure, lab studies give you tons of control, but can a guy holding a bloody paper knife really compare to the sheer terror of a real shooting? Probably not. This also gets into some sticky ethical territory. Is it okay to deliberately freak people out for an experiment? Then there's this other big idea. Maybe the weapon focus effect isn't about fear at all, but just surprise. A bloody knife is weird and shocking, and that alone might be what grabs your attention. And of course, we have to remember that people are different. Your personality, your age, all of that affects how you handle stress. And finally, maybe the biggest question of all, is that neat little inverted U-curve just a bit too simple to explain something as incredibly complex as human memory under pressure? And acknowledging that complexity, a researcher named Deffenbacher later came up with an updated model. He called it catastrophe theory, which sounds dramatic, I know, but it suggests that after you hit that peak performance level of anxiety, the drop-off isn't a gentle slope. It's a sudden, cliff-edge, catastrophic collapse in your memory. And honestly, that might be a more realistic picture of what happens when stress truly becomes too much to handle. You know, for any of you studying this for A-levels, this stuff can get really tricky. So if you ever want to do a deeper dive and really nail these complex ideas, there are resources out there to help. And all of this leaves us with one final, absolutely critical question. We've seen that anxiety can boost your memory, it can destroy it, or it can be somewhere in between. So with all this scientific infusion, how is a judge or a jury supposed to know what to do with the testimony of an eyewitness who was, understandably, absolutely terrified? It's a question where psychology smacks right into the real world, and the consequences